It had been decided 5 months in advance that breakfast would be taken in the countryside near Paris on the name day of Madame Dufour, whose given name was Petronille. And since this festive outing had been eagerly anticipated, everyone rose at the crack of dawn that morning. Monsieur Dufour, having borrowed the milkman's cart, took the reins himself. The two-wheeled carriage was neat and tidy. It had a canopy supported by 4 iron rods, with curtains attached, though these had been lifted to allow for a better view of the landscape. Only the rear curtain fluttered in the wind like a banner. His wife, seated beside him, beamed in a silk dress of an astonishing cherry hue. Behind her, perched on 2 chairs, sat the elderly grandmother and a young girl. Also visible was a shock of yellow hair belonging to a boy who had no seat and was sprawled across the bottom of the cart, with only his head poking out. After passing along the Champs-Élysées and crossing the fortifications at the Porte Maillot, they began to take in the surrounding scenery. Upon reaching the bridge at Neuilly, Monsieur Dufour declared, "Well, here's the countryside at last." At this cue, his wife began to marvel at nature. On the round square of Courbevoie, they were struck by the breadth of the horizon. To the right lay Argenteuil, its church tower rising skyward, beyond it, the hills of Sanois and the windmill of Orgemont. To the left, against the clear morning sky, stood the aqueduct of Marly. Farther still, one could make out the terrace of Saint-Germain. Directly ahead, behind a chain of hills, the churned-up earth marked the site of the new fort at Cormeilles. And far off in the distance, beyond the plains and villages, stretched the dark green of the forests. The sun was beginning to scorch, and dust kept getting into their eyes. On either side of the road unfolded a barren, grimy, foul-smelling plain. It was as if leprosy had swept through, gnawing even at the houses, skeletal remains of half-ruined and abandoned buildings, or shacks left unfinished due to unpaid contractors, their 4 roofless walls reaching skyward. Here and there, tall factory chimneys rose from the sterile soil, the only vegetation on these putrid fields, where the spring breeze carried the scent of kerosene and coal, mingled with something even less pleasant. At last, they crossed the Seine a second time, and on the bridge, everyone was enchanted. The river sparkled and shimmered, a light mist of vapor rose above it, absorbed by the sun. There was a sense of gentle peace, a refreshing coolness at last. They could breathe air not tainted by factory smoke or the stench of refuse. A passerby informed them that the place was called Bizorne's. The carriage came to a halt, and Monsieur Dufour began reading the enticing sign of a tavern: Poulin's restaurant, boiled and fried fish, private rooms for parties, gazebos, and swings. "Well, Madame Dufour, does this suit you? Your call." His wife, in turn, read aloud: Poulin's restaurant, boiled and fried fish, private rooms for parties, gazebos, and swings. Then she carefully examined the building. It was a country inn, painted entirely white, built right alongside the road. Through the open doors one could see a gleaming zinc counter, in front of which stood 2 workmen dressed in their Sunday best. At last, Madame Dufour made up her mind. "This will do nicely," she said. "And the view is lovely too." The carriage rolled onto a broad lawn behind the inn, lined with tall trees and separated from the Seine only by a narrow strip of riverbank. Everyone climbed down from the cart. Monsieur Dufour jumped down first and opened his arms to receive his wife. The step, fixed to 2 iron rods, was set very low. To reach it, Madame Dufour had to reveal the lower part of her leg, whose former slenderness had long since vanished beneath the creeping tide of flesh that had overtaken her thighs. The countryside was already putting Monsieur Dufour in a playful mood. He nimbly pinched his wife's calf and, gripping her under the arms, lowered her heavily to the ground like a great bundle. She patted the dust from her silk dress and looked around. She was a woman of about 36, plump, blooming, and pleasant to behold. Breathing was difficult under the strain of a corset pulled too tight. The heaving mass of her ample bosom, squeezed by laces, rose all the way to her double chin. Behind her, the young girl leapt down lightly, using her father's shoulder for support. The fair-haired boy placed 1 foot on the wheel, climbed out, and helped Monsieur Dufour unload the grandmother. The horse was then unhitched and tied to a tree, and the cart tipped forward, its shafts buried in the ground. The men removed their coats and washed their hands in a bucket of water, then joined the ladies, who had already settled themselves on the swings. Mademoiselle Dufour was trying to swing while standing, alone, but couldn't manage to gain enough momentum. She was a striking young woman of 18 or 20, one of those whose mere passing in the street sends a sudden jolt of desire through you, leaving you restless and vaguely stirred until nightfall. She was tall, with a slender waist and wide hips, her skin deeply tanned, her eyes large and dark, and her hair black as pitch. Her dress clung to the firm curves of her body, which were further accentuated by the movement of her hips as she strained to swing. Her arms stretched upward, gripping the ropes, and her chest rose gently with each thrust she gave the swing. A gust of wind had torn off her hat, which now lay behind her. The swing gradually gained height, revealing her shapely legs up to the knees with each ascent, while the flutter of her skirts sent a heady breeze toward the faces of the two smiling men more intoxicating than the fumes of wine. Seated on another swing, Madame Dufour groaned monotonously and without pause. "Cyprien, push me, Cyprien." At last her husband approached, rolling up his sleeves as if for hard labor, and with great effort helped her get going. Gripping the ropes with both hands and stretching her legs to avoid scraping the ground, she surrendered to the soothing motion of the swing. Her ample figure quivered with each jolt, like jelly on a platter. But the swing's arc kept growing, her head began to spin, and fear crept in. Each time she descended, she let out a piercing shriek, drawing a crowd of local boys who came running. Through the blur, she could vaguely make out their mischievous faces peering over the garden fence, contorted with laughter. A maid approached, and breakfast was ordered. Fried fish from the Seine, stewed rabbit, salad, and dessert, Madame Dufour declared with solemn authority. "Bring 2 liters of table wine and a bottle of Bordeaux," added her husband. "We'll eat on the grass," the girl chimed in. The grandmother, utterly charmed by the inn's cat, had been chasing it for 10 minutes, lavishing it with the sweetest terms of endearment. The animal, perhaps flattered by such attention, stayed just out of reach of her outstretched hand, calmly circling the trees, rubbing against their trunks with its tail raised and purring softly in delight. "Look," cried the fair-haired lad, who had been wandering about. "Now those are boats." Everyone went to see. In a small wooden shed hung 2 splendid skiffs for river sport, sleek and finely crafted, like pieces of luxury furniture. Long, narrow, and gleaming, they resembled 2 tall, slender young women. They stirred a longing to glide across the water on a quiet evening or a bright summer morning, to race past blooming riverbanks where trees dip their branches into the stream, where reeds whisper in constant tremor, and where kingfishers dart out like blue lightning. The family gazed at the skiffs with reverent admiration. "Oh yes, now those are boats," Monsieur Dufour affirmed gravely. He began to enumerate their virtues with the air of a connoisseur. In his youth, he too had rowed, he said, and with a craft like that he mimed the motion of pulling oars, he hadn't a care in the world. Back in the day, at the Joinville regattas, he'd bested more than one Englishman. He made a pun on the word ladies, the French term for oarlocks, joking that amateur rowers never go out without their ladies. As he spoke, he grew animated, insisting he could easily cover 6 miles an hour in one of those boats, without even trying. "Breakfast is served," announced the maid, appearing in the doorway. Everyone hurried over, only to find that the best spot, mentally reserved by Madame Dufour, was already occupied by 2 young men. They were clearly the owners of the skiffs, dressed in rowing attire. Lounging half-reclined in their chairs, their faces were darkened by sun, their chests covered only by thin white paper-thin jerseys, and their arms, strong and muscular like blacksmiths, were bare. These strapping fellows flaunted their strength, yet their movements held that supple grace born of physical training, so distinct from the bodily distortions inflicted on laborious by monotonous, heavy toil. They exchanged a quick smile at the sight of the mother and glanced knowingly at the daughter. "Let's give up our spot," said one of them. "It'll give us a chance to get acquainted." The other immediately stood, holding his half-red, half-black beret in hand, and gallantly offered the ladies the only shaded place in the garden. The offer was accepted with a flurry of apologies, and the family settled on the grass without table or chairs, to lend their breakfast a more rustic charm. The 2 young men moved their plates a few steps away and resumed their meal. Their bare arms, constantly in view, made the girl feel uneasy. She deliberately turned her head and pretended not to notice them. But Madame Dufour, bolder and driven by a distinctly feminine curiosity, perhaps even a flicker of desire, kept glancing at them, likely not without a pang of regret as she thought of her husband's hidden ungainliness. She sat on the grass with her legs tucked beneath her like a tailor, shifting about now and then, claiming ants had crawled under her. Monsieur Dufour, irritated by the presence and politeness of strangers, tried to settle himself comfortably, but failed. Meanwhile, the fair-haired young man ate in silence, as if for four. "What lovely weather, sir," said the plump lady, addressing one of the rowers. She wished to be gracious, in thanks for the spot they had surrendered. "Yes, madam," he replied. "Do you often come out to the countryside?" "Oh no. Just once or twice a year, to get a breath of fresh air." "And you, sir?" "I come here to sleep every evening." "Oh, that must be delightful." "Indeed it is, madam." And he began to describe his daily life in poetic tones, so that the hearts of these city dwellers, deprived of greenery and starved for walks in the fields, might beat faster with that naive love of nature that torments them all year behind shop counters and office desks. The girl, moved by his tale, lifted her eyes and looked at the boatman. Monsieur Dufour opened his mouth. "Now that's living," he said, then turned to his wife. "Would you like another piece of rabbit, darling?" "No, thank you, my dear." She turned again to the young men and, pointing to their bare arms, asked, "Don't you ever feel cold like that?" They laughed and horrified the entire family with tales of their grueling excursions, of sweating through swims, of rowing through nighttime fogs, all the while pounding their chests to demonstrate the sound it made. "Oh, you do look strong and healthy," said the husband, no longer daring to speak of the days when he bested Englishmen. Now the girl was watching them out of the corner of her eye. The fair-haired lad, caught off guard, began coughing violently and splattered wine across Madame Dufour's cherry-colored silk dress, provoking her indignation. She demanded water to wash out the stains. Meanwhile, the heat was becoming unbearable. The shimmering river seemed to blaze with fire, and the wine fumes clouded their heads. Monsieur Dufour, overcome by a fierce bout of hiccups, unbuttoned his vest and the top of his trousers, while his wife, suffocating from the heat, discreetly loosened the bodice of her dress. The shop assistant cheerfully shook his flaxen manet, pouring himself more wine at every opportunity. The grandmother, feeling tipsy, sat unusually upright and with great dignity. As for the young girl, nothing in her demeanor betrayed any change, only her eyes shimmered with a vague, unfocused light, and the blush on her dusky cheeks deepened. The coffee finished them off. They broke into song, each taking a turn with a verse, which the others applauded with wild enthusiasm. Then, with great effort, they rose to their feet. The women, dazed and breathless, could barely stand, while Monsieur Dufour and the fair-haired lad, thoroughly drunk, began attempting gymnastic feats. Heavy and sluggish, their faces flushed crimson, they dangled awkwardly from the rings, unable to lift themselves by their arms. Their shirts threatened at every moment to slip out of their trousers and flap like banners in the breeze. Meanwhile, the rowers had launched their skiffs and returned, graciously offering the ladies a ride on the river. "Dufour, do you mind?" "Please," cried his wife. He looked at her with drunken eyes, comprehending nothing. One of the oarsmen approached, holding 2 fishing rods. The hope of catching a gudgeon, a cherished dream of every shopkeeper, lit up the dull gaze of the simpleton. He gave permission for everything asked of him and settled into the shade beneath the bridge, legs dangling over the water, beside the fair-haired lad, who promptly fell asleep. One of the rowers gallantly sacrificed himself. He took the mother into his boat. To the little wood on the Englishman's island, he shouted as they drifted away. The other skiff moved more slowly. The oarsman was so captivated by his companion that he ceased to think of anything else, overcome by a tremor that robbed him of all strength. Seated on the helmsman's bench, the girl surrendered to the sweet sensation of drifting over water. Thought seemed impossible, her body was at peace, her mind lulled into a languid oblivion, a kind of growing intoxication. Her cheeks flushed, and her breath came in shallow waves. Under the influence of wine, intensified by the warm currents of air flowing around her, she began to imagine the riverside trees bowing gently in her path. A vague yearning for tenderness, a stirring of blood, spread through her body, awakened by the heat of the day. And yet she felt a quiet unease at finding herself here, alone on the water, in this scorched landscape where the sky seemed to have burned away all life, alone with a young man whose gaze caressed her skin like kisses, whose desire scorched her like sunlight. They were unable to speak, their eyes wandering over the scenery, which only heightened their agitation. At last, He made an effort and asked her name. "Henriette," she said. "What a coincidence." "Mine's Henri," he replied. The sound of their voices calmed them slightly, and they turned their attention to the shore. The other skiff had stopped and seemed to be waiting for them. One of the rowers called out, "We'll meet you in the woods. For now, we're heading to Robinson's, my lady's thirsty." With that, he bent to his oars and sped off so swiftly that he soon vanished from sight. A low rumble, which had been faintly audible for some time, began to swell rapidly. The river itself seemed to tremble, as if the sound were rising from its depths. "What is that noise?" Henriette asked. It was the rush of water falling through the lock at the tip of the island. Henri tried to explain, but suddenly, amid the roar, a bird's song pierced the air, distant, delicate, unmistakable. "Listen," he murmured. "The nightingales are singing in daylight. That means the females are nesting." A nightingale. She had never heard one before, and the thought of it stirred tender, poetic images in her heart. The nightingale, silent witness to lovers' trysts, summoned to Juliet's balcony, celestial music that harmonizes with human kisses, eternal muse of wistful romances, opening azure dreams to the tender hearts of sentimental girls. She was about to hear a nightingale. "Let's be quiet," her companion said. "We can moor here and sit close by." The skiff glided silently over the water. The trees of the island came into view, their banks so gently sloped that the eye could penetrate deep into the thickets. They moored, tied up the boat, and Henriette, leaning on Henri's arm, began to make her way with him through the branches. "Duck down," he said. She bent low, and through the tangled maze of branches, leaves, and reeds, they slipped into a hidden refuge, one that could never be found without knowing it was there. Laughing, the young man called it his private chamber. Just above their heads, in one of the trees that sheltered them, the nightingale burst into song. It poured out trills and roulades, its strong, vibrating notes filling the air and seeming to vanish beyond the horizon, rolling along the river and drifting across the fields in the sultry stillness that hung over the plain. They sat side by side in silence, afraid to startle the bird. Henri's hand slowly encircled Henriette's waist, holding her in a gentle embrace. She, unoffended, brushed away the bold hand, and did so again each time it crept back, yet she felt no embarrassment at the gesture, as if it were entirely natural, and just as naturally, she repelled it. She listened to the nightingale's song, enraptured. An infinite thirst for happiness awakened within her, sudden waves of tenderness swept through her being, like revelations of some unearthly poetry. Her nerves grew faint, her heart softened, and she began to cry without knowing why. Now the young man held her close, and she no longer pushed him away because she simply wasn't thinking about it. Suddenly, the nightingale fell silent. A voice called out from the distance. "Henriette." "Don't answer," he whispered. "You'll frighten the bird." But she had no intention of answering. So they remained seated for a while longer. Madame Dufour was likely somewhere nearby, for now and then faint cries could be heard, the playful squeals of the stout lady, apparently being courted by another boatman. The young girl continued to weep. She was overcome by a strange, sweet sensation, and felt unfamiliar tingling pricks on her flushed skin. Henri's head rested on her shoulder, and suddenly he kissed her lips. A fierce indignation flared within her, and she leaned back to escape him. But he fell upon her with his whole body. He chased her elusive mouth for a long time, finally caught it, and pressed his lips to hers. Then she, maddened by a storm of desire, clung to him and returned the kiss, all resistance crushed beneath the weight of passion. All around them, the world was still. The nightingale sang again. First came 3 piercing notes, like a cry of love, then, after a moment's silence, it began to weave slow modulations in a weakened voice. A tender breeze rustled through the leaves, and in the thicket 2 passionate sighs rose and mingled with the bird's song, with the soft whisper of the forest. It was as if the nightingale had fallen into a trance. Its voice grew stronger, like a fire catching hold, like a mounting passion, echoing the cascade of kisses beneath the tree. Then its rapturous song turned frenzied. At times it lingered on a single note, as if drowning in melody. Sometimes it paused, releasing only 2 or 3 long, delicate tones, ending in a high, piercing cry. Or it burst into a wild tempo, scales cascading, vibrating, tumbling in abrupt notes like a song of mad love, ending in triumphant shouts. Then it fell silent, listening to a moan that rose from below, so deep it might have been the soul's farewell sigh. The sound lasted a few moments, ending in sobs. When they rose from their green bed, both were deathly pale. The blue sky seemed dimmed, the blazing sun extinguished in their eyes. They felt the weight of solitude and silence. They walked quickly, side by side, without speaking, without touching, as if they had become bitter enemies, as if their bodies recoiled from each other and their souls harbored mutual hatred. From time to time, Henriette called out, "Mama." A rustling stirred beneath one of the bushes. Henri thought he glimpsed a white skirt hastily lowered over plump calves, and then emerged the enormous lady, slightly flustered, even more flushed than before, her eyes gleaming, her chest heaving wildly, and standing perhaps a little too close to her companion. The latter, evidently no stranger to such amusements, wore a face that betrayed involuntary flickers of amusement. Madame Dufour gently took his arm, and the two couples made their way back to the boats. Henri, still silent, walking beside the girl, fancied he heard the muffled sound of a long kiss. At last, they returned to Bizorne's. Sobered up, Monsieur Dufour was beginning to lose patience. The fair-haired young man was snacking before departure. The cart stood harnessed in the courtyard, and the grandmother, already seated inside, was beside herself with despair and fear. Night would catch them on the plain, and the outskirts of Paris were not safe. Hands were shaken, and the Dufour family departed. "Goodbye," the boatman shouted. Their only reply was a sigh and a tear that slipped down. 2 months later, passing along Rue des Martyrs, Henri noticed a sign on a door, "Dufour, hardware merchant." He stepped inside. The stout lady was in full bloom behind the counter. They recognized each other instantly, and after a flurry of pleasantries, he asked, "And how is Mademoiselle Henriette?" "Very well, thank you, she's married." "Ah!" Emotion caught in his throat. He went on. "And to whom?" "Why, to that young man who was with us that day, remember? He's going to take over the business." "I see." He prepared to leave, deeply saddened, though he couldn't say why. Madame Dufour called after him. "And how is your friend?" she asked shyly. "Very well. Give him our regards, won't you? And if he happens to pass by, tell him to stop in." She blushed deeply and added, "It would give me great pleasure, do tell him that." "Certainly. Farewell." "No, until we meet again." A year later, on a sweltering Sunday, Henri suddenly recalled every detail of that adventure so vividly, so enticingly, that he returned alone to their woodland retreat. Entering the grove, he was stunned. She was there. She sat on the grass with a melancholy air, and beside her, still without his jacket, slept her husband, the fair-haired young man, like a marmot. Seeing Henri, she turned pale, and he feared she might faint. But then they began to speak with such ease, as though nothing had ever passed between them. When he told her how much he loved this place, how he often came here on Sundays to rest and remember, she looked into his eyes with a long, searching gaze. "I think about it every evening," she said. "Well, darling," said her husband, yawning as he awoke, "looks like it's time we headed home."